Many things in nature have normal distribution. For example, if you measure people's height, weight, IQ, or personality trait, you'll get a normal distribution. But there are things we deeply desire that are not normally distributed. Of those are success and productivity. Let's take a scientist as an example. A successful scientist will define an unanswered question about nature and works hard to answer it correctly and publishes his results in a peer-reviewed journal for others to use. Then, when you look at the distribution of scientists based on their productivity, you find an extremely skewed distribution, with majority producing only one paper while a handful produce hundreds of papers. And hard work plays a small role in where you may land in this distribution, whether it is the number of papers you publish, number of citations your papers get, number of YouTube videos you make, number of views you get on YouTube, or how much money you make. You won't get the same success as someone else may get for the same amount of effort doing the same thing. The questions are, why is this so? And what determines where you will land in this distribution? In other words, how can you beat this system? To answer these, I will investigate the history of science to see how science was used to study science itself, looking for qualities of highly successful scientists. I will present a good definition for eminence or high success based on a measurable index of science and its statistics. And lastly, I will talk about attributes that successful scientists and in general successful people have, and then we can find out how to win the game of life. Who was first to investigate scientists' productivity? Sir Francis Galton, grandson of Erasmus Darwin and Charles Darwin's cousin, hypothesized that genius was hereditary. He looked at high-ranking Englishmen in science, monarchy, and society to see if they were all related. He published his results in 1874 in his book called English Men of Science. He published another book, Hereditary Genius, 5 years after Mendel published his Hereditary Genetics. He measured eminence using criteria such as being recently mentioned in the 2,500 men of the time or in Times obituaries. He noticed 1 in 2,000 men were eminent, while it was 1 in 20,000 for general population. For scientists, however, the eminence threshold was meeting 2 or more of the following criteria: membership in Royal Society, having a university chair, medals or rewards presented by a learned society, holding an office in such societies, or membership in an elite scientific club of academic worth. Among all eminent men, he counted 10% active in science, leading to 1 eminent scientist in 200,000 people. His generosity in counting was to compensate for the ones he overlooked. But Galton conducted his study in 1870s. Did the numbers change since then? In 1903, James McIntyre wrote American Men of Science, currently in print as American Men and Women of Science, summarizing biographical information of American scientists. Carroll started with 1,000 names and added a constant number each year. There was 11 eminent names per million in the first edition. In 1938, there was 12.4. This was while the number of scientists and scientists per capita were doubling every 12.5 years and 17 years respectively. The reason for this stable density could be that Cattell used different criteria for distinguishing eminent scientists, or the 1,000 name quota and constant annual increase were out of proportion to reality. But the main reason seems to be that his definition of eminence was a rigid yes or no answer, independent of time and distribution of scientists, because a scientist may be elite but not recognized. This is equivalent to selecting an IQ score as the criterion. The proportion of people above the threshold is always constant with time. Then, how can we define a criterion that is not a yes-no bar? We can measure an acceptable index for each scientist and look at the distribution. But this index must be correlated to eminence. We will start with publication count. You can argue that this is not a good criterion because it incentivizes scientists to increase their quantity rather than quality of their publications. Nonetheless, eminence is highly correlated with productivity. For example, Wayne Dennis looked at National Academy of Sciences biographical memoirs between 1943 to 1952. He found that publication count of 41 men who lived past 70 ranged from 786 to 27. Their average was 200 papers, with 15 members having less than 100 papers. Similarly, among Royal Society's members, he found that top 10% had over 50 papers and half were featured in the Britannica for their distinguished work. Of the top 5%, 70% were in Britannica. None of those mentioned in Britannica had fewer than 7 papers. But how can we use publication count as our criterion? We can go on Web of Science and compile a list of authors who published in a journal and count how many times they published there. Then we can plot the distribution, number of authors who have N papers. This was what Lotka did in 1926 on Auerbach's Historical Tables of Physics and Chemical Abstracts. He found that distribution of productivity is a power law distribution. Here, C is the frequency of single paper authors and A is a constant. For Auerbach and Chemical Abstracts data, A was about 2 and 1.9 respectively. Pareto distribution of wealth is another case where A is equal to 1.5. Leave a comment if you'd like to watch a video about Pareto distribution of income in the future, and subscribe and tune in so you don't miss it. C divided by N squared is called inverse square law of scientific productivity. For simplicity, we call it Lotka's law. We can use it to find the total number of scientists in the field and the average number of papers per author just by knowing the total number of papers published. It implies that the number of authors with 2 papers is quarter of those with 1 paper, and so on. Analytically, assuming highest publication count is infinite, we see about 61% of authors publish only 1 paper. For our data, 49% of authors published only once and A was 1.87. Note that we didn't account for authors' position in multi-author papers and number of authors per paper. In 1957, William Shockley showed that single-author papers also resulted the power law distribution. He ranked Los Alamos' researchers based on their cumulative science abstracts entries in a 4-year period. Researchers who ranked 0 through 64 had 0 publications. Those who ranked 65 through 96 had only 1, researchers from rank 97 to 116 produced 2 papers, and so on. Then, this graph was converted to the distribution we are familiar with. He also ranked the scientists at Brookhaven National Lab based on their solo publication counts, as well as total and weighted publication counts, and plotted logarithm number of publications as a function of rank. Again, he found a power law distribution. Even correcting for the number of authors per paper, the distribution remained consistent. It seems inescapable. Shockley further found that those who had single-author papers were also collaborating most with many others, contributing to idea formation and development, a key aspect of eminence. Lotka's law implies that science does not fall from heaven through random processes. Productivity depends on multiple prerequisites, so we should not expect to get Gaussian or Poisson distribution of productivity. It also gives us Price's square root law. Let's say we have 100 authors and we rank them based on their publication count. Let's assume that the top ranking author has 144 papers. Then, according to Price's square root law, top 10 authors publish 50% of papers and their lowest publication count is 3/4 of a square root of highest publication count, 9 papers. This gives us an immediate measure of eminence. Square root of total number of scientists are eminent scientists who do 50% of the work, and the least productive among eminent produces 3/4 of a square root of what the most productive among them produces. Now let's apply Price's square root law to our data. We see out of 74,509 authors, the top 273 authors produce about 11% of the work. In fact, we are not the first ones to try this. Paul Travis Nichols already showed that Price's square root law does not fit either the empirical data or the simulations. Then, is Price's square root law wrong? Price himself admits that Lotka's law needs modification. This is because Lotka's law does not limit the largest score and fails for highly prolific authors. For the cumulative distribution, number of authors who have P papers or more, Price recommends this instead and fits Lotka's data with it. For authors with less than A papers, this distribution is K over P. For those who have more than A papers, the distribution is AK over P squared. AK is the total number of authors, where 10% of them have 10 papers or more and 1% of them are highly prolific at the level of National Academy of Science. In Lotka's law, a problem with its interpretation and application, Price and his objectors showed analytically that Price's square root law can be derived from Lotka's law, albeit with a few additional assumptions. There, Price provided the general form of his rule, that there is a score M for which half of the papers are published by authors who have M papers or more. Price assumed that the largest score was the number of papers at which there was only one author who published more than that. This was a valid assumption because Lotka's law does not apply to highly prolific authors who are scattered here and there at the heavy tail of the distribution. So, we can always use the general form of Price's square root law, that a small proportion of authors produce major proportion of the work. When we use the 80-20 rule, 80% of work done by 20% of scientists, we are basically pointing to a specific power law distribution with a specific exponent. Now that we took publication count as our criterion for eminence and have seen how scientists with different productivity levels are distributed based on it, we need to investigate what really drives productivity from a biological and psychological perspective. So, do we see this disparity of productivity in other animals? 3 littermate rats were trained to push a lever on one side of a cage as their job and receive food on the other side as their salary. When all 3 rats were placed in the cage at the same time, they all did their job. But when one pushed a lever, he never got his reward. Instead, other rats got the reward. They kept doing what they were trained for, not getting what they meant to, so hunger built up to the point that they showed aggression and frustration towards the bowl they got food from. But it did not help until one of them started to show aggression towards the lever. He pushed the lever so many times that the other 2 freeloaders were satiated, and the 3rd rat, the hard-working hero, finally managed to receive the reward he deserved. In the end, the productivity gap showed the disparity among the rats. The disparity in productivity was the natural response of the biological system. But how can we quantify the relation between productivity, effort, and genetics? Productivity, creativity, and success have multiple prerequisites that are not independent and random. They drive the result non-linearly. We can see the nonlinear process, for example, in Lotka's law, that the cutoff score is not the mean or median, but 3/4 of the geometric average. Furthermore, we intuitively know that the effort to go from 1 paper to 2 papers is the same as going from 100 papers to 200 papers, and not like going from 100 to 101, as the layman may think. The Weber-Fechner law in psychophysics, a field founded by Gustav Theodor Fechner, describes the relationship between a perceived change in a stimulus and the original stimulus. Gustav Fechner, Weber's students, refined this law by providing a mathematical formulation, showing that the perceived change is inversely proportional to the initial stimulus. Mathematically, delta P, the change in perception, is proportionate to delta S, the change in a stimulus intensity, divided by S, the initial intensity of a stimulus. This equation will give us the logarithmic relationship between perception and a stimulus, like light or sound. So, taking the number of papers as a stimulus, the effort, or its perception, is proportional to log of new number of papers divided by initial number of papers. In this sense, log of 2 over 1 is equal to log of 200 over 100. The more you practice something, the better you get at it, making it effortless in the long run. So, persistence and perseverance, among others, are the qualities of successful people and make up the constant K, among other genetic factors. Therefore, for the same effort that your friend doubles his output, you may not be able to double yours because your K constant is different from his. Going back to 1957, Shockley found that this logarithm number of publications has a normal distribution. He argued that the ability of individuals to keep multiple ideas in mind and realize the relation at the same time is the reason for this log normal distribution. For example, assume there are a total of 5 ideas. Then the person who can keep 2 ideas in mind has 20 combinations to invent. But the one who can keep 3 ideas has 60 ways of producing an invention, making him 3 times as likely to produce. He further argued that productivity requires multiple independent attributes that are multiplied to give the final productivity prerequisites. So, a small variation in one or more can result in huge advantages for the individual. But what are the attributes that correlate with productivity? Higgins and colleagues showed that IQ, dorsolateral prefrontal cognitive abilities, and personality trait conscientiousness correlate strongly with high academic performance. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the center for high-level cognitive tasks and executive functions like working memory, cognitive flexibility, planning, inhibition, and abstract reasoning. They also looked at personality traits in Big Five model and found that conscientiousness correlates strongly with academic performance and can predict it on its own. Jordan Peterson has many great lectures on this topic and explains all the personality traits in details. I left the links in the description. Now, since scientist, as we have assumed, has a PhD degree and getting a PhD degree requires a robust academic performance, we can safely assume that successful scientists have relatively high IQs, high dorsolateral prefrontal cortex abilities, and high conscientiousness. Other studies show that high research performance is positively correlated with openness but negatively correlated with extraversion and neuroticism. Those who have high openness are interested in creative artistic activities. They like arts, intellectual and philosophical activities and can come up with new ideas that they like to pursue. High neuroticism makes the individual more sensitive to negative emotions. A unit of a stressor will cause 10 times more anxiety, fear, and stress in a highly neurotic person compared to the average person. In an individual who's at 90th percentile neuroticism, the K constant in Weber-Fechner law is larger compared to the 50th percentile individual. So we can conclude that IQ is not the only determining factors of success measured in terms of productivity or other indices. In an experiment in early 20th century, Louis Terman followed 1,470 children with IQs 140 or more for more than 50 years. After 50 years, 20% were clear disappointments and had no successful careers. Some were very successful and some others were average. Among bottom 150, only 8 received a graduate degree and a dozen only graduated high school. Among top 150, 98 of them received graduate degrees, 10 times more than bottom 10%. The disparity among top 1% in IQ shows that high IQ does not guarantee success. But the most mind-boggling fact was that among children who were excluded from the experiment because of the IQ threshold, 2 won the Nobel Prize in Physics while none of the participants managed to achieve such level of success. As Thomas Sowell says, and I'm paraphrasing here, you can have an IQ of 170, but if you're illiterate, it is useless to you. Now, what are the implications of log normal distribution? Price defines solidness as log of number of publications, which is normally distributed, like IQ. A scientist with 1 paper has solidness of 1 and one with 100 papers has solidness of 2. Immediately, we can deduce that logarithm of number of scientists with solidness S decreases linearly. Price then claims we see this constant linear drop in Army's General Cognitive Test's normal distribution tail. Every 11 points increase in AGCT is equivalent to 10-fold decrease in number of people. But he did not try to provide any other attributes that influence solidness. We can consider the distribution of individuals along the combination of influential factors: personality, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex abilities, IQ, and other variables we may have missed to more accurately define solidness, which can be a topic for PhD research and beyond the scope of this video. So far, we have established that Lotka's law of productivity is the result of multiple normally distributed factors, Weber-Fechner law, and Shockley's multivariable model. Now, if we follow Price and only consider IQ, then what is the average IQ of a scientist with solidness of 0? In 1958, Harman studied intelligence of 7,787 PhD graduates with average age of 32 years using the AGCT with median of 100 and a standard deviation of 20. Average AGCT scores of fields ranged from 140 for physics to 123 for education. Here, we see AGCT scores on the horizontal axis. The dotted smooth curve corresponding to dotted vertical axis represents the general population's AGCT distribution. The solid polygon corresponding to solid vertical axis represents Harman's sample. This solid curve with this vertical axis shows the number of PhDs per 1,000 individuals for same AGCT score. Among highest scorers, 175 and above, only 1 in 5 pursues a PhD, in our terms becomes a scientist. Price assumes that highest IQ makes the eminent scientist. Then he argues that to increase eminent scientists 5-fold, the total number of scientists must grow 25 times, from 8,000 to 200,000. He suggests using Harman's average AGCT score of 130 with rarity of 1 in 15 as threshold, providing a pool of 160,000 individuals from 2.4 million people of same age group. Harman's sample showed 1 PhD per 3,100 people of the same age group. Right now in the US, we have 167 million people under 32. The threshold gives us 11.13 million potential scientists. 1.1 million would produce 10 or more papers, and 111,300 would publish more than 100 papers. This equates to about 33,400 ordinary and 334 eminent scientists per million of population as the higher limit. Price's estimation in 50s and 60s was 400 per million. Both estimations exceeds Galton's and Cattell's we saw earlier. But is this limit a hard limit? Can we really increase the number of top scientists by an order of magnitude? Yes, it is a hard limit. Harman's study showed that 4 out of 5 potential top scientists are not pursuing science. Price attributed this to lack of opportunity, incentives, access to good schools, and competition. He predicted instead of addressing these hurdles, we would focus on increasing scientific manpower, hoping the number of exceptional ones rises proportionally, a prediction that came true. Reaching this limit is challenging, and pouring every eligible individual into science will come at the cost of other fields. In 2022, 57,700 PhDs were conferred in the US, representing 9.1% of eligible individuals based solely on IQ, a significant increase from 4% in 1960s. Notably, Nearly half of these PhDs were awarded to immigrants, compared to just 13% in 1963. But Mortimer Adler teaches us that we are allowed to disagree with an author when he's uninformed or when his argument is incomplete or incorrect. Price assumes only IQ determines eminence, and his argument is logically correct. But he ignores openly admitting other factors that make an eminent scientist. High IQ doesn't guarantee a Nobel Prize. Perseverance and persistence, characteristics explained by conscientiousness, among many others, also play a crucial role. It is probably the case that at most 1 in 5 of highest IQs can become scientists, simply because needing 2 prerequisites, each with rarity of 1 in 15, leads to a chance of 1 in 225 to have both. So we can't agree with Price that the other 4 will be eminent scientists if they are trained. So far I have proved the proposition I stated in the previous episode and promised to prove, that the science cannot grow forever because the number of people who can become scientists is limited. Now, let's talk about fields. We can define the solidness of a field as logarithm of number of researchers in that field. A field with 100 researchers has a solidness of 2, and a field with 10 researchers has a solidness of 1. So, which one is superior? A field with solidness of 2, or 10 fields each with solidness of 1, adding up to a total solidness of 10. Science wants to minimize its solidness. It seems that scientists gather in small groups and fields, small groups gather in small institutions, and these institutions absorb more groups to become a larger institution, a process of crystallization. The size of large institutions like universities grows at the same rate as the small groups are created. In this manner, giants in the lead will remain in the lead by constantly absorbing the small groups and individual manpower. Falling behind and moving backward is an exception to the rule. Usually the giants stagnate in their mature state until another growing giant who has a higher growth limit surpasses them. We can see this in the growth of cities. In human behavior and the principle of least effort, Ziff ranked cities based on population and plotted the log-log graph. Over many decades, the slope of the line was constant as the line moved up. This meant that the population of first rank grew at the same rate as the number of small cities. Cities moved up and down in rank, but to be in the first place, cities had to reach higher and higher populations. The same phenomenon is observed in lists of sizes of faculties, number of PhDs per decade of college scientific departments in any field or in general, or in any country. This behavior is also followed by ranked lists of scientific contributions in terms of number of papers, journals, or expenditure of nations of the world. Finally, we can answer the main question we started with. How can you beat the system? Take our model for effort. Since log of new number of papers is normally distributed, we can induce that the effort is also normally distributed. Then you may think that two individuals with the same effort and same initial number of papers must get the same final number of papers for their effort. And this is where you got it wrong. The problem is our false hidden assumption about these two individuals, that they are the same. They are not, because the constant k that equates the effort with the log is a function of other normally distributed factors like personality, IQ, and prefrontal cortex abilities. So if equity or equality of outcome is your life or political goal, I'm sorry to say that laws of nature do not allow it. Price wrote, about this process there is the same sort of essential built-in on democracy that gives us a nation of cities rather than a country steadily approximating the state of uniform population density. Scientists tend to congregate in fields, in institutions, in countries, and in the use of certain journals. They do not spread out uniformly, however desirable that may or may not be. In particular, the growth is such as to keep relatively constant balance between a few giants and the masses of pygmies. The number of giants grows so more slowly than the entire population that there must be more and more pygmies per giant, deploring their own lack of stature and wondering why it is that neither man nor nature pushes us towards egalitarian uniformity. Yes, there is a built-in democracy in the system and most will be least productive. But remember the rat experiment? We are creating a situation where there is only one lever to elevate them all, like sending everyone into computer science, physics, or AI. And that will exacerbate the uneven distribution of success and inequality of outcome. It is in our nature to follow the masses. As Carl Jung says, where the many are, there is security. What the many believe must be of course true. What the many want must be worth striving for and necessary and therefore good. Just look at how many people are parroting AI these days. Many of them on their own in the field they are in feel that they can't be highly productive. To escape the fear and misery of uselessness, they jump the bandwagon and join the herd. But success has multiple prerequisites, and we saw that even the smartest of us may not make an eminent scientist. By the way, I did not even attempt to discuss external prerequisites like luck. Veritasium has a good video on that you can watch. Then some of you may say, oh, I'm failing because I do not have the genes, or I'm not smart enough, or conscientious enough, or I'm too neurotic. To that I say, you're dealt a hand, and you must find the game you can succeed in, a game that is most meaningful to you. The hand only sets the limit and amount of effort you need to get there. There are many logistic curves you can pick and grow along, some better than others. Just remember they won't be the same as someone else's. So do not compare yourself to who someone else is today. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday. The power law we saw also applies to your efforts. Not everything you do is supposed to produce the success you seek. 80% of your output is made by 20% of the things you do. Working hard does not increase your success because you increase your effort across all your activities. Working hard and smart is to increase your effort and efficiency in the 20% that actually produces the results you want. Then there is the power law that applies to your products. Not everything you produce will be successful the same. For example, not all of your papers will be cited and celebrated equally. Or if you're a YouTuber, then your views across your videos follows the power law. But eventually you will produce something that will be the crown jewel of your creativity. A paper that answers an important scientific question and wins you a prize. A YouTube video that attracts millions of views and makes you tens of thousands of dollars and puts you among the best. Or a trade that fills your bank account with profits and make you rich. And doing this is extremely difficult because the probability of making such a successful outlier product by the order of the power law is a dismal 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000. But you are built for adversity. If you put yourself in new difficult situations, new genes get activated in you that help you adapt. Knowing your abilities and pushing beyond those limits will increase your limits. You just have to keep on keeping on. So, understand yourself, just pick one goal and keep on keeping on, constantly learning from your mistakes and adjusting your aim to reach the top of your curve.
The point is that there's some games you don't get to play unless you're all in. And the other thing that's so interesting about being alive is that you're all in. No matter what you do, you're all in. This is going to kill you. So I think you might as well play the most magnificent game you can while you're waiting. Because do you have anything better to do? Really? Why not pick the best thing possible that you could do? Why not do that? Maybe you could justify your wretched existence to yourself that way. I think you could. That's what it looks like. You know, people find such meaning in the responsibilities they adopt, it stops making them ask questions about what life is for. If you have a newborn, and so then I think, well, if you got your act together, it'd be better for you, and instantly it would be better for your family, assuming they wanted you to get your act together, and not everyone does, and then it would be better for the community. It's like, how far could you take that? If you stopped wasting time, and if you stopped lying, and if you oriented yourself to the highest possible good that you could conceive of, and you committed to that, how much good could you do? Well, I would say, why don't you find out? So that's what I think you should do. You should find out. Because you're more powerful than you think. Way more powerful than you think. I mean, God only knows what you are in the final analysis. You're blind to your own weaknesses, but you're also blind to your own strengths.
So you made it to the end. Were you thinking incorrectly about success and how successful you should be? Do you think there are other attributes that correlate with success and productivity that I missed? Please let me know in the comments what you think about this video. All the sources, references, and links are in the description. Thanks for watching and see you next time.